And welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. What we did was in March, we took a survey of 1,000 Americans, adult Americans, and this was right about the time that the Willow decision was being made by the Biden administration. So we really wanted to focus this kind of on fossil fuels and kind of how Americans look at fossil fuels as that relates to energy. And interestingly enough, as contentious as this issue is, particularly in the media and the political sphere, there really is probably more consensus than not amongst Americans on how they feel about fossil fuels and energy and where we need to be going in the future. And really what Americans, the way we kind of sum up the survey results is that Americans really looking for balance. I mean, they see the role that renewables are going to play in the future, and they think that that should grow as we move into the future. But they also don't see fossil fuels going away anytime in the near future. So, and that there's a lot of consensus around that. But let me start with this first slide here, which I think is very interesting. Is that overall Americans across the political spectrum, across the ideological spectrum, feel that we should be focusing on developing our own energy and being able to have access to our own energy and not relying on foreign imports for energy. And that's about 3/4 of Americans. And if you look at just the Republican-Democrat divide, even though it's 11 points, you still have even Democrats, 70% of Democrats say that we should be really utilizing our own energy resources to try to control that and not necessarily be relying on imports. And as you'd expect, Republicans are even more supportive of that at 81%. Next slide, Maureen. We also asked some questions about expanding domestic production and also building extra and additional infrastructure to move that energy around the country. And as you can see from the charts, a majority, 5.5, 6 out of 10 Americans favor us expanding domestic production, and about 6 out of 10 Americans favoring the building of additional infrastructure, pipelines and whatnot, to move that energy around where it needs to go. And again, a majority of Republicans and Democrats in both of those categories favor moving that. So 66% of Republicans, 53% of Democrats, and 46% of independents favor the expanding of domestic production. And as for building additional infrastructure, 65% of Republicans, 58% of Democrats, and 51% of independents feel that we should be building additional infrastructure so that we can utilize our domestic resources. Next slide, Maureen. All right. This one is very interesting. And again, it just really kind of goes to where Americans are looking for a balanced approach as we look at fossil fuels and nuclear and renewables. The way we asked this question was, you've got 3 scenarios. One is where you're only going to invest in renewable research moving forward, excluding existing any other kind of fossil fuel or nuclear research. One was just doing nuclear and fossil fuel research, no renewable, or should we be doing both? And again, 2/3 of Americans, 64%, say, listen, we really need to rely on both, and we should be looking at both, figuring out how renewables can become better, more efficient, more cost effective, and also how do we make existing fossil fuel and nuclear technologies cleaner. Next slide, Maureen. And again, that's very consistent across the political and ideological spectrum. The idea of investing both, as you can see from the chart. Great. Another interesting question we asked was, as we look into the future, here's a whole list of energy sources. What should be expanded and grow in the future? What should be contracted? What should stay the same? And as you can see from our list, renewables obviously top the list of what Americans are thinking that hope should be expanded and used more as we move into the future. Solar, wind, and hydro came up at the top of that list. Interestingly enough, nuclear it does not fare well. Only 25% of Americans think that should be expanded. And then obviously coal and oil come at the bottom of the list for expansion, but a plurality of particularly oil think that that it should stay the same. And again, and this is where we start to see some political differences. So Democrats, 69% say solar should be expanded. That's compared to 50% of Republicans and 62% of independents. Democrats think that wind should be expanded. 63% think that wind should be expanded. That's compared to just 40% of Republicans and 55% of independents. Where the Republicans tended to be higher than the other partisanship would be natural gas, where 48% of Republicans said natural gas should be expanded, where only 26% of Democrats and 26% of independents thought that should be expanded. Republicans were also more likely to say nuclear should be expanded, 34%, where 19% of Democrats, 23% of independents say it should be expanded. And also with oil, 36% of Republicans think that oil should be expanded as we move into the future. And that's compared to just 12% of Democrats and only 16% of independents. And then the last slide I've got, we wanted to kind of get an idea of with all this talk about being carbon neutral by 2050, how realistic is it? And overall, you've got a third of Americans saying we may get there, about a third of Americans saying I don't know, and we got about a third of them saying yes, we'll get there. But what was really interesting to me is only 5% of Americans definitely think that we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. And again, there are Democrats are a little more optimistic, as you'd expect. 9% say definitely, 31% say probably. We'll probably get there. And then Republicans and independents almost mirror each other. Only 3% and 2% of independents say we'll definitely get there. And 16% of Republicans, 17% of independents say that we may probably get there as we move forward. So that's the political environment that we're dealing with, particularly as it relates to fossil fuels. So Maury, I'll pass it back to you.